Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, November 6th, and Professor Marandi is here with us. Welcome back, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me, Neil.
Let's get started with what's going on right now in the United States. Trump wins the 2024 presidential election. What does it mean for the conflict in the Middle East?
It's difficult to say, sorry, it's difficult to say at this stage because Trump is a bit of a loose cannon. He is somewhat unpredictable. A lot of course, that we know about Trump has been told to us by his opponents. So exactly how unpredictable he is or how easily influences he is by as they've claimed that the last person to see him is the person who has who makes the uh, greatest influence on his decision making. These things I really don't know because I don't have that sort of access to see if it's true or not. But I think there are a number of things that we have to keep in mind. One is that since 2016, the world has changed. It's changed a great deal. I remember it was today, 8 years ago, I was in class. I already knew that Trump won the election, but one of my very liberal and pro-American students, she suddenly screamed in the middle of class, and I knew what had happened. She just, I guess, discovered that Trump had won, and she was really very upset. But I think the situation now is very different from back then. The United States is not the United States of 8 years ago. The world is not the same as it was 8 years ago. Trump is not the same person that he was 8 years ago. I don't mean that he's any better. What he did to Iran is unforgivable. He reimposed the maximum pressure of sanctions. He tried to strangle Iran as much as possible, killing ordinary people, targeting ordinary people, in fact, to be more precise. And also, he murdered General Soleimani, who was the greatest national hero in the country. And he was the person who led the fight against ISIS and Al Qaeda, two groups that the United States helped strengthen during the Syrian dirty war. The only reason why Trump, very late in the day, began to fight against ISIS was because the United States saw that it was being defeated and they didn't want the Syrian government to take back their own territory. So the United States started fighting against ISIS. But it wasn't because they were against it, they were funding it, they were supporting it. Even as he himself admitted when he was campaigning for the 2016 election, he said, and he said it probably under the influence of General Michael Flynn, who was the head of the previously the head of the uh, Defense Intelligence Agency. He said that the United States created ISIS, which was true. So um, Trump, he has changed, uh, but that doesn't mean again that he's any. We can forgive him, but uh, but I think he's going to have a lot of trouble at home. We already see how his opponents are reacting towards his victory. There's a looming economic crisis in the United States, which I think will be perhaps unprecedented. The global South, the global majority is emerging more powerful. China, I think, is more capable today or more, let's say, realistic today about the United States. The United States and US-Russian rapprochement will not be easy. The Russians have many demands in Ukraine, and I don't believe that President Putin is going to give them up just for the sake of Mr. Trump. So if Trump gives the concessions that Russia wants, then he will be humiliated. That will be a major defeat for the United States. And if he doesn't, then the Russians will continue to press their advantage in Ukraine. In our part of the world, the Israeli regime is despised. Those who support the regime are deeply unpopular. The regime is despised more or less across the board, across the world, with exceptions, but still. And so Trump has many problems. Iran and the resistance are much more powerful today than they were before. Iran has emerged from sanctions stronger. And here there's a couple of myths that I think we have to deal with. One is that Trump is not the person who created the maximum pressure sanctions. That was Obama. And Trump revived them. And he attacked Obama for reducing them, not for removing them. Because after the nuclear deal, Obama reduced some of the sanctions, but he never removed them. He never even removed the ones that he was supposed to do so within the framework of the nuclear deal. So the Iranians in the 2015 deal, they abided by their side of the bargain. Obama didn't. So we had strong sanctions before the deal. Many of the sanctions remained after the deal. And then Trump revived the sanctions and intensified them. But Biden never removed them. And this is another myth. Biden didn't remove any of the sanctions. In fact, I recall that many people close to Biden were saying that, or people who felt that they could rely on the Democratic Party, people inside Iran, were saying that when Biden comes to power, he's going to sign a presidential decree removing all of Trump's sanctions that violated the nuclear deal, which would be like, I don't know, 70, 80% of the sanctions. Although I didn't believe that would happen, I turned out to be vindicated. I was vindicated, and Biden retained all of those sanctions and continued to build on the sanctions regime. What changed was that President Raisi shifted Iranian policy, where he said, I'm not going to wait for the Americans. I'm going to start building relations with the global South. I'm going to start relying more on capabilities at home. And then if we can have a deal with the West, fine. But I'm not going to wait for them anymore. That was one shift. But also another major event took place, and that was Ukraine. After the war in Ukraine and the sanctions that were imposed on Russia and the divide that was created between the West and Russia, two important things happened. One was that Iranian-Russian relations improved dramatically, and so did Iranian-Chinese relations and Iranian-Russian relations. But Iranian-Russian relations improved a lot, very swiftly. But in addition to that, because of the sanctions against Russia, and in particular Russian oil, the Iranians suddenly saw a huge rise in the number of customers who wanted Iranian oil. So Iranian oil production increased rapidly. Iran gradually reached maximum production, and gradually it also did away with the discounts that it gave. So Iran's oil sales today are very different, are completely different from what they were before the war in Ukraine. So many things have changed. And it's not as if Biden was more lenient than Trump. No, Biden was pursuing the same policies. He wanted to keep the sanctions to increase suffering in Iran so he can get concessions from the country. But fate was had a different fortune for Iran, and global circumstances, including internal circumstances, changed the amount of decreased significantly the amount of influence that the United States had on the globe to marginalize Iran. So I think that Trump is, again, not in the position that he was 8 years ago. And one thing also that I would add is that the Europeans are much weaker as well, and they have a dislike towards Trump. So the sort of consensus that he could, I mean, the US under Trump was not able to create consensus. But their reluctant allies, their allies that did not like Trump back then, were stronger than and more influential than they are today. Europe, especially after Ukraine, has taken a beating, and therefore, I think that the circumstances for Iran have changed dramatically, and for the resistance, and for the Palestinian people, for Lebanon, for Hezbollah. It's going to be much more difficult for the United States, I think, to retain its influence in our region and probably across the world.
When it comes to Donald Trump's mindset about Iran, recently he had an interview in which he was talking about Iran. He said that he has no problem with Iran, just the nuclear program. He wants to negotiate with Iran. If he goes in that direction, as he mentioned in that interview, let's assume that. Do you think Iran would be willing to talk with him, or Iran's priority right now is what's going on in Gaza, in Lebanon, and on they can talk about nuclear program, but the priority is what's going on there?
Well, a number of things have changed again. One is that, as I explained earlier, Iran is much more powerful today. Iran and its allies, the Axis of Resistance, they're much more powerful today than they were 8 years ago. Look at Yemen, in particular, how things have changed. Look how Hezbollah has been able to prevent Israelis from advancing into Lebanon, which is quite astounding. The Israelis have been unable to effectively enter Lebanon, and still they failed to take the dot called Gaza. But that aside, there are a number of things that have changed. One is that the Israeli regime, as long as it's making threats against Iran and Iran's nuclear program, or any other nuclear threats, then what would be the incentive for Iran to sign a nuclear deal? Because we've seen Dr. Kharazi, who's the leader's foreign policy advisor, say very explicitly that if there's some sort of existential threat against Iran, or an attack on Iran's nuclear program, Iran's nuclear posture will change, and that Iran can very swiftly develop a nuclear weapon. Iran is one of the 10 most advanced countries in the world when it comes to nuclear energy. And of course, Iran's military capabilities are now well known and well respected. And in the past, the West liked to ridicule it, but now I think they think very differently. So I think that would be a major calculation. As long as there's a threat from the Zionist regime, then I think Iran will view its nuclear program very differently. In fact, perhaps in the eyes of many, it's very fortunate that Trump actually left the nuclear deal, and that Biden failed to abide by the deal or negotiate a deal with Iran, because today the threats of being made by this maniac in Tel Aviv are taken seriously in Iran. So that's one issue. The second is that the world has changed. 8 years ago, when Trump was in power, the focus of the United States was Iran. Iran was the real enemy. It was the evil. It was the axis of evil. And Russia, of course, was an issue. Trump opponents used Russiagate against him, which was fake. It was never a real thing. There was never any evidence for Russiagate. But Hillary Clinton and her people couldn't accept the fact that some game show host was able to humiliate her this way, so it had to be someone else. But and China was becoming an economic competitor, which was a concern, a growing concern. But Iran was the bad guy. But now that has changed. The United States, during the last few years, has antagonized so many different countries, and in particular China and Russia, that now whenever they name Iran, they name it alongside these two countries. So in the past, it was Iran. Now it's Russia, China, and Iran. So that makes it a lot more complicated. And of course, Iranian relations, as I said earlier, with these countries have evolved significantly during this period. And these countries are concerned about the United States. So Iran knows that a failure by Russia is not good news for Iran. Failure in Iran would not be good for Russia. And the same is true with China. Any success by the Americans anywhere would lead to the United States becoming, the regime in Washington becoming more aggressive and more hopeful for further successes. So these dynamics have changed significantly. Also, and this, by the way, I think is going to influence U.S. Capability to try to undermine Iran, because the United States, not only does it impose economic sanctions, and not only does it support terrorist groups that are based in northern Iraq, in Europe, and on the border in the no man's land alongside the Pakistani border, but also the United States has a huge anti-Iranian Persian language media apparatus. It's enormous, and tens of thousands of people are employed by it. Iranians, tens of thousands of people, and many thousands of them are Iranian. The different television channels, websites, Telegram channels, all sorts of cyber armies. Tens of thousands of Iranians must be employed across the world. Now the United States, because of Russia, because of China, is no longer going to be able to focus as it did before on Iran. And we are already seeing signs of these media outlets having financial difficulties, some of them more than others. So the Americans cannot focus on Iran in the way in which they used to. And as I said, even though many say that Trump is going to patch things up with Russia, I don't see that happening easily. A lot of blood has been spilled, but also, as I said, the issue of Ukraine is either going to be a Russian victory or it's going to be continued warfare. And a Russian victory would mean that Trump will have to concede a huge deal, a lot. And that would be very humiliating for him. His opponents would make it a humiliation for him. This is, of course, something that should have ended 2.5 years ago. And we all knew from the very beginning that NATO would fail. We all knew that the counteroffensive would fail. And we knew that what's happening now would ultimately happen. But the Americans and the Europeans have paid a heavier price, thus weakening themselves even further. But patching things up with Russia, I don't think is going to happen that easily. So we are where we are, and it's very difficult to predict the future. But again, I think that the United States is in a much more difficult situation in this region than it was before, and Trump is going to have to face a new reality. And most importantly, is that people on the streets across the region have reached boiling point. They are outraged, whether in Egypt, whether in Saudi Arabia, whether in Turkey, and I'm not quite sure how that will play out.
Last night, we've learned that the defense minister of Israel was fired by Netanyahu. And do you think, is that related to what's happening right now in the southern part of Lebanon and the way that Hezbollah is fighting them?
I think that the Minister of Genocide, his removal, is not good news for the Israelis. I think it's very bad news. It's good news for Netanyahu. But as I always believed, Netanyahu is Israel's worst enemy. Netanyahu is fighting for his own survival, not for the survival of this genocidal apartheid regime. His priority is Netanyahu, and therefore he will do anything that it takes to preserve power, to remain at the top. And ultimately, that is going to damage the interests of these Zionists, these ethno-supremacist Zionists who live in Palestine, who control Palestine. And that's exactly what has happened over the last year. In what's happened, pro Netanyahu Israelis, or many of his opponents, consider the last year or so to have been a success. But I think they're sort of in an echo chamber, and they are listening to themselves, and they don't see how things have changed. You know this, and your viewers know this, but just to remind ourselves, Israel once could go all the way to the Suez Canal swiftly, take over Sinai. Now it cannot defeat Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other allies in this dot called on the map called Gaza. Once upon a time in 1982 and before, but also in 1982, the Israeli regime was able to go all the way to Beirut within 4 or 5 days and then take the capital. Now Hezbollah has pushed them back. They tried to take Al-Khiyam, and in a heroic battle, the Hezbollah beat them back. So the Israeli regime has failed in Gaza. It's failed in Lebanon. Yes, they're massacring people. Just last night, they carried out numerous massacres. A big massacre in a village in Lebanon, and of course in Gaza as well, among other and massacres. And Western media is silent. They're always silent, and it's very interesting. In Gaza, they pretend we don't, that they don't have a presence, but in Beirut, I know some of these journalists. I know many of them, but they hide the fact that ordinary people are being targeted. So the Israelis are killing ordinary people, but they're not winning on the battlefield. And so far in its exchange with Iran, it doesn't have the upper hand. In the airstrike on Iran, as I said before, it wasn't a success. If it was a success, we would have seen it. They did cause damage. People were killed, but they were supposed to wipe out the Iranian air defenses and shock us. We were supposed to not know what hit us, but that certainly didn't happen. So I would say that it's clear that the Israelis have failed on all these fronts, and then there's the Iraqi resistance, and then there's the Yemeni resistance that's constantly striking at Israel and causing hurt. And it's only going to get worse. And of course, we have the Iranian strike that is going to come. And I personally, from the very start, didn't believe that Iran would strike the Israeli regime. I didn't want to say this before, because even though I don't have any government position, but I didn't want to decrease concerns among people in Palestine, Israelis in Palestine. I didn't think Iran would strike before the U.S. election, because I don't think it would have been appropriate. It could have been interpreted as interfering in U.S. internal affairs, and ordinary people in the United States or across the West. There's no need to unnecessarily antagonize them. So I think that the Iranians did the smart thing by not striking before the U.S. election, but the Iranians will strike, and they will strike very hard. Of course, President Pezeshkian did give a statement, or he said basically that if there's a ceasefire that's acceptable to Hamas and Hezbollah collectively, because Hezbollah has said that they will not accept a separate ceasefire. It has to be along with Gaza, and it has to accept Hamas, the term set by Hamas. So he did say that would impact the severity of or the way in which the Iranians would strike Israel. So basically, what Dr. Pezeshkian was saying is that we're going to hit the Israeli regime, because this is retaliation. They began this this aggression, and Iran is responding. But he said that if there's a ceasefire for the sake of the people of Gaza and Lebanon, we are willing to lessen the, the number of missiles and drones and so on that are used. But since I don't see that happening, and I don't see a genocidal maniac like Netanyahu moving towards a ceasefire, I think the Iranian strike is inevitable. It is inevitable, but I think it will be quite severe.
We saw that the United States, right after the attack on Israel, they sent two air defense systems, two new air defense systems, THAAD. And moments ago, before coming up to this live, we've learned that Hezbollah used a ballistic missile and hit the target, bypassing all the air defense system of Israel, including THAAD. And I think right now in the United States, they totally know if they want to go to escalate the conflict between Iran and Israel, that would be devastating for Israel, because Iran, the capabilities of Iran and the way that they're capable to hit the targets in Israel is not even comparable to the capabilities of Hezbollah.
Yes, if the two sides choose to slug it out, as they say, then Israel would be defeated. There's no doubt about it. The Israeli regime is very small. It's not a strong regime. The West likes to mythologize and say that this is the superpower in the region, or the most powerful military in the region. It's not. A military that's dependent completely on the West, that needs a air bridge to constantly bring in new bombs so that they can bomb homes in Gaza and in Lebanon, bombs from Germany, from Europe, from the United States, new weapons, new assistance, economic assistance. That is not a powerful regime. That is a very vulnerable regime, but it's also very small. So if Iran chooses to hit the regime very hard, it would fall apart. And you have to keep in mind, Nima, that if things get bad inside Israel, half of the population is Palestinian. If Iran begins, and Iran has many more missiles than people imagine. Iran can go wave after wave after wave, and still without touching the missiles that would be used to destroy the Persian Gulf if there's a conflict with the United States, because those are a completely different set of missiles. The missiles that would be used to destroy American bases and to destroy the oil and gas installations across the Persian Gulf are short-range missiles and drones, hundreds of thousands of drones. And we've seen how those drones work. We saw how Aramco was so badly damaged with just a handful of drones. Where they came from, whether it was Yemen or elsewhere, that's another issue. So all that aside, Iran can fire wave after wave of a thousand missiles for a very long period of time. They can destroy its infrastructure. They can destroy the desalination plants. They can destroy their electrical power plants. And then and of course the military, if they do that after a few waves, how is the Israeli regime going to control, our 7 million Zionists, many have left, but how are 7 million Zionists going to control 7 million Palestinians? 20% of them are inside the 1948 borders. The rest are in the West Bank in Gaza. How's the Israeli regime going to do that? And then you have the Hezbollah on the northern border as well, right? And then you have many Jordanians who'd like to come in and fight, and maybe some are preparing themselves for that opportunity, and perhaps in Egypt as well. So this is not a battle that the Israeli regime can win. They're completely dependent on the West. But again, Netanyahu, being the fool that he is, and being the selfish person that he is not calculating in a way which benefits Israel. He is calculating in a way in which benefits Netanyahu. But ultimately, I don't think Netanyahu is going to benefit from this. I think that he will be remembered as the person who actually brought the Israeli regime to destruction.
Do you see any sort of change in terms of the US foreign policy in Lebanon? Because they've been trying to isolate Hezbollah in the Biden administration, but how do you see the changes with the new administration in office, with the Trump administration?
One of the things that has happened over the year is that the status of Hezbollah in this has grown, not only in Lebanon, but across the region and the world. Hezbollah today is very popular, and many of the divisions in Lebanon have been washed away among ordinary people. Remember, in the previous decade, the United States led a dirty war against Syria. Many people were fooled, especially since these Arab despots in the Persian Gulf and Erdogan and the King of Jordan, and of course the Israelis were all a part of this conspiracy against Syria. We know that Jake Sullivan on February the 12th, 2012, sent an email to Hillary Clinton saying that Al Qaeda is on our side in Syria. This is like a decade after 9/11. And then soon after that, ISIS emerged from Al Qaeda, and we saw the 2012 Defense Intelligence Agency document where it was stated that US allies in the region wanted to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq to block Syria's access to friends, to further strangle the country, Jordan in the south, Turkey in the north, Israel to the southwest, and then of course shutting the gates to Iraq and Iran to the east. What was that Salafist entity? It was ISIS. And of course, we know what Trump said during the campaign in 2016. So it's now becoming clear that the attempt to destroy Syria was so that Israel could today destroy the resistance, and that this bridge, this victory bridge between Iran and Iraq and its allies and Lebanon and Syria and the West Bank and Gaza, that could be broken. But back then, a lot of people were fooled by Western media, by local media, regional media that was controlled by these despots, very wealthy despots, who were using sectarianism and racism and other means to demonize Hezbollah, Iran, and other resistance movements. And so there was that was reflected in Lebanese society. Lebanese society was divided, deeply divided. In the last election, the Hezbollah coalition, they won, but the divisions were deep. But after what we've seen in Gaza on October the 7th, and the fact that Hezbollah began making huge sacrifices for them, and Ansar Allah and others, the mood changed. Palestinians now love Hezbollah. No one believes the propaganda that these despots were pushing, the West was pushing, Erdogan and Abdullah and others were pushing, and the Israeli regime. Sunnis in Lebanon, they've shifted. Ordinary people, many of those who are politicians, they have affiliations that are outside of Lebanon, but ordinary people have tilted dramatically towards Hezbollah. The main antagonist is Sami Jaja, the Lebanese forces, and people like them, and they will always hate Hezbollah. They were people who fought with the Israelis in 1982 when they invaded Lebanon. Back then, Hezbollah didn't even exist, but Sami Jaja carried out with the Israelis a huge massacre in the Sabra Shatila refugee camp, the Palestinian refugee camp, killing 4,000 men, women, and children in 36 hours. And he is an ally of the U.S. Embassy right now. So the U.S. is going to have a very tough time convincing the overwhelming majority of Lebanese that they and their allies are the good guys and that Hezbollah and their allies are the bad guys. Things have changed a lot. And as I said, it's not just in Lebanon, it's across the region and it's across the world. Today, the axis of resistance is popular outside of the Islamic world. It's visible. It's quite visible. Iran has become popular. For over 4 decades, they demonized Iran. Iran, they made Iran look like an evil, corrupt, despotic, woman-hating, violent regime. And now people are seeing that they're the genocidal maniacs, the collective West, supporting these ethno-supremacist monsters. And the only people standing in their way are those who are in the axis of resistance. And so the resistance has, it's people are seeing, they're opening their eyes to this reality that it is Iran. Whatever Iran is, whatever values Iran has, whatever the Islamic Republic of Iran is, it is that which is standing against genocide and standing up to the collective West alone. So the things have changed dramatically for Hezbollah, for Lebanon, for the region, and therefore for the United States. And I think that when Trump steps into office, he's going to see that he's going to notice very quickly that the world is not the world that he became a part of in 2016 or the world that he left in 2020.
Do, do you think right now we have two countries, Iraq and Syria, in which there are a lot of American soldiers? And Trump, in his first term, he tried to withdraw the troops, at least he talked about it, withdraw the troops from Syria. Do you think he's gonna have the same type of policy, or these people like Pompeo, Nikki Haley, and Tom Cotton, these people would dominate his administration? Because we know how they hate Iran and the axis of resistance. On the other hand, they have personal interest in Ukraine as well. Not it's just about Iran.
But I don't think they're any different from Blinken. I don't think they're any different from Jake Sullivan. It's not as if the United States under Biden is any more sane. Or, I mean, after all, it's Biden who said if there wasn't an Israel, we'd have to make one. So, he's calls himself a Zionist. So it's not as if these people are going to bring something new to the table. I would actually argue that these people are less sophisticated, and therefore it's going to be more difficult for them to create consensus, especially at this time when the United States and the West in general, they've destroyed their image. No one believes that they support human rights or women's rights or children's rights or any sort of rights. No one believes that anymore after what's happened in Gaza. So when he comes to power, I don't know where he's going to, which direction he'll take, because again, it's unclear really who he is and what he stands for. Some of the people who surrounded him have left, and some, as you've mentioned, are still there. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the United States is not the military power that it was before. It has exhausted itself in these endless wars, and ordinary Americans don't want more war. I think even though the Western media has, I mean, the West is not, these are not democracies. These are not democracies in Europe and the United States. In the United States, the choice is between a Biden or a Harris now and a Trump. That's the degree of democracy that they have. And in Europe, whoever they vote for ultimately has to obey Harris or Trump, whoever is elected. It doesn't matter who's in power in Europe. They have to obey Washington. So these are not democracies. But the United States is not the power that it was before, and people in the United States are waking up to the fact that the United States is neither a democracy, it is suffering economically, its endless wars have diminished the country and its capabilities. They're seeing that despite the media, despite the legacy media. And so Trump will have a very difficult time justifying a new war. And I wouldn't take some of US actions too seriously. So, for example, you know that the Americans sent a number of B-52s to Qatar. I would call that the most stupid decision possible. Why? A, it discredits Qatar. And when Iran says, okay, if there's conflict, we're going to destroy all those oil and gas installations, the United States is explaining to the world exactly why. Qatar is used as a US airbase. Well, what is a B-52 going to do in Qatar? Iranians can wipe out the whole airbase in minutes. The missiles, the short range and middle range missiles that Iran can fire from the land and from the sea and from the air can destroy the whole country. Why would a B-52 be stationed right in front of the Iranians? It's not a serious act. It's a token act. They know that they cannot attack Iran from Doha. But actually, as I said, it hurts them because it only diminishes Qatar in the eyes of the region, the public of the region. People across the region are saying, why is Qatar allowing the Americans to use their territory to threaten the resistance? So on the one hand, you have Al Jazeera, and then on the other hand, you have these American bases. They're only reminding people what Doha means for the United States. So these are not real threats. It's not as if these B-52s mean anything. They can't do anything from Doha. And I think perhaps, and I don't know for certain, perhaps the Americans they sent them to Qatar to tell their public that we're strong, but also to tell the Iranians that, look, we're not going to do anything. Because the Iranian military knows quite well that these planes are completely vulnerable, just as the air base is vulnerable. And I would add that the very presence of American bases in the Persian Gulf make the United States vulnerable, and in Iraq. This is not the 1980s or the 1990s where those bases were way across the other side of the Persian Gulf. This is a new world that we're living in. Missiles and drones are the new weapons. Look at in Ukraine how dependent the Russians are on drones that they claim are Iranian. Whether that's true or not, it's none of it's not for this discussion. But we live in a different world. A few bases on a few in a few mini countries are not going to and do not constitute a threat to Iran. Not only would those bases be swiftly destroyed, but so would those regimes. And the same is true in Iraq. The resistance in Iraq would immediately overrun American bases. So each of these is an Achilles heel. Each one of these bases. The Americans are literally hostage. And so are those regimes that host them. So the Americans have not evolved, even though the world has evolved. Someone is paying a huge amount of money for each of these bases. In most cases, it's the American people. Someone was telling me earlier today that Trump, he wants to, he has an isolationist tendency, which is a good thing, so that he can rebuild America for the decades to come. And I was saying, well, true, but the United States has 800, 900 military bases across the world. Can Trump really voluntarily shut down those bases? Will they let him do that? Unless it's forced upon the United States by an economic collapse. I don't see that happening. So in any case, these bases are a heavy burden on the United States and those regimes in the region. And they're more of a threat to the United States and these regimes than they are to Iran.
I think the main question, the crucial question right now is what leverage does the US government have in terms of putting pressure on Iran or even Russia? Because with the power of sanction just decreasing during the conflict, as we've seen in Ukraine, it seems that the government, the deep state in Washington, is not interested in having a direct war with Iran nor with Russia in Ukraine. And do you think the reality of what's going on right now, in terms of sanctions not being that powerful as before, and they cannot go to a direct war with any of these countries, how the only option on the table would be negotiations and having some sort of political settlement? How do you see the possibility of that?
Well, that goes back to what you said earlier when Trump was speaking about Iran a few days ago. And he was basically saying, we can't run our own country. And how are we going to bring about regime change? One of those Iranian Americans who's never been to Iran for the last 45 years, knows nothing about the country, was saying, was encouraging him on regime change. And he said, look, we can't even run our own affairs. How are we going to? So he's become more realistic. But then again, removing those bases, does Trump have that um, capability? Does he have the capability to end the war in Ukraine? Those are serious questions. Does he have the ability to do a deal that's acceptable to Iran? Will they let him, even if he wants to do something like that? We already saw what he did with North Korea. Probably one of the few smart moves that he ever made was with North Korea, but it failed because the deep state, the people around him, they didn't allow it to happen. So obviously the smart thing to do would be for Trump to move towards de-escalation across the world. But I find it very difficult to see him being able to do so, especially with the people that you have named and who were a part of his campaign. And on the final day of his campaign, Pompeo spoke, and a very insane group of people, but they are a part of his entourage. We don't know what positions, what positions they'll take in government. We know that Kennedy, some of the things that he said sound more sane, but when it comes to Israel, the Israeli regime, it seems like he has one of those. They probably have something on him. Someone has something on him because he sounds completely insane. Whether it's an Epstein or one of those many Epsteins that are in the United States, when it comes to Palestine, he's completely, he sounds like a Pompeo. So it's difficult to say. But the biggest question is whether the state will allow him to do anything. I think, and I may be wrong, and you should speak to Americans about this sort of thing, but I think that the United States is heading towards a grave and major challenges at home, both because of the coming political crisis, something that even Musk has alluded to, the coming crisis, which is an accumulation of many things. His opposition, which they are urban, they are powerful, they are wealthy, and many highly educated. And I mean the Democratic opposition, the Democratic Party. And then you'll, of course, have the many young Americans who are completely opposed to the genocide and who I think are increasingly becoming detached from the regime itself. Someone said today that the turnout was much lower than 4 years ago. I think it was like 15 million people less, if I'm not mistaken. That's what I was told. I'll have to check on that. And 10 million, extra people could have voted. So that's effectively a decline of 25, 26 million people. And despite the fact that the two sides hate each other, these 25, 26 million people, or something like that, they decided to say, we don't want to be a part of this. Many of the people who voted for Harris, they didn't like her, opposed the genocide, but believed that she would do something later on and that Trump was worse. Quite a few people among Trump supporters tell me that when he comes to power, he's going to change policy and put pressure on the Israeli regime. So a lot of wishful thinking on behalf of Harris supporters and Trump supporters, or at least a segment of them. But those that wishful thinking, if I believe it's wishful thinking, but that those who were optimistic on both sides, they were critical of the United States. So the United States is going to have many difficulties at home. Trump is going to be attacked left, right, and center by the deep state. He is going to have a lot of difficulty because they're going to constantly try to undermine him. After all, they tried to kill him. So I don't know how much power he really will have to change U.S. policy in a big way. Personally, I think what will likely change U.S. policy is the collapse, the coming collapse that many people are talking about, where the U.S. economy is simply going to be hit very hard. And that will possibly force a complete rethink, because the current status quo will be seen by everyone as obviously unsustainable. All these military bases, all these expenditures, they're going to have to end. That, I think, has a better chance of changing U.S. policy than Trump does, assuming that that's what he wants to do. And it's when you have Pompeo and you have these people, I wouldn't be very optimistic.
I think one of the main issues in his mind, and he would do something about it, is the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia right now. To what extent, in your opinion, they're gonna interfere in the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Is that going to be a big issue in their mind, in your opinion?
Well, again, Nima, I think we have to go back a bit. First, we have to remember that in 2015, Obama gave the green light for the genocide in Yemen. So the dirty war in Syria. So if Trump is not a good actor, but we have to remember that the dirty war in Syria, Obama. The genocide in Gaza, in Yemen, Obama. The destruction of Libya, Obama. And the list goes on. The drone strikes. But when Trump came to power in 2016, after the election in 2016, early 2017, the reality on the ground was that Yemen was facing, sort of like Gaza and Lebanon, it was a genocidal attack by the Saudis, very wealthy, wasting hundreds of billions of dollars, and the Emiratis, wasting tons of money. And the collective West was behind them. The Canadians, the British, the Germans, the French, the Australians, they were all working together to carry out this genocide. I think it sounds familiar. Very, very familiar. Back then, Yemen was struggling to survive. The Saudis wanted to keep their hegemony over Yemen, and that's why they were carrying out this genocidal war. They failed. The Yemen that Trump is going to have to come to terms with today is a Yemen that's very strong. Saudi Arabia is very vulnerable to Yemen. If there is a conflict forget Iran and Saudi Arabia, if there's a conflict between Yemen and Saudi Arabian oil assets will all be destroyed. I mean, if it comes to that, the Saudis cannot win. Yemen today is far more powerful than it was 8 years ago, 4 years ago. We see it. They're striking Israel, striking a highly vulnerable Saudi Arabia with drones and missiles is very easy. In fact, that's what brought the ceasefire. That's what brought an end to the war. Yemen became increasingly powerful. They started striking Saudi oil assets, and the Saudis said, okay, let's stop. Otherwise, this genocide would have continued. So Saudi Arabia is not in a very strong position. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia is doing nothing for Gaza. It's doing nothing for Lebanon, nor these other oil-rich dictatorships in the region. So they're not in a position where they can suddenly join Trump against Iran. And Iran also is trying to improve their relations with the countries in the region that have traditionally been in the US camp. We saw the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That, of course, wasn't just China. It actually started with a letter from the Saudis to Iran. General Soleimani was going to Baghdad to discuss with the prime minister at the time that letter for de-escalation and gradual rapprochement when Trump murdered him. So Trump murdered General Soleimani as he was going to see the Iraqi prime minister to discuss the Saudi letter. So that's really back. It was back then there were already moves to de-escalate. And the prime minister told me personally, Adel Abdul Mahdi, he wasn't prime minister when he told me, it was after he was, but I met him and he with 2 or 3 other people, and he was explaining to us what happened. And he said himself directly to me that the General Soleimani was seeking de-escalation with Saudi Arabia. And that is probably one reason why Trump murdered him. So, but then the negotiations began in Iraq and Oman, and of course, ultimately in Beijing, they came to an agreement. And I think the Iranians want to preserve that, and so does Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not the Saudi Arabia of 10 years ago. Remember, as I said, first of all, the technology for war has changed. You know, the same thing that applies to US bases, that applies to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis couldn't beat Yemen then. They certainly can't beat Iran or Yemen now. And the population at home is not happy with what's going on in Gaza. Early on in Gaza, 96% of Saudis were supporting the resistance. They were hostile towards the Israeli regime. So I don't see a situation where the Americans can use any of these countries in the region against Iran. It would bring about an end to the oil and gas market in this region, not only in the Persian Gulf, but also in Iraq, but also in the Caucasus. And that would just bring down Western economies. You'd have tens of millions of people on the move across the world because the whole global economy could collapse, whether it's Latin America or whether it's in Africa or Asia. And the traditional routes are to the West, even though the West would be collapsing too. And so that would make the sort of movement of illegal immigrants, as Trump likes to talk about them, who eat our cats and dogs, as he said, that would make them, as he claimed, that would make what's happening now look fantastic. So I don't see. I mean, it could happen, but I think there's still enough sane people in the Pentagon, sinister but sane, who would not like to see a major conflict in our region. And I don't think Saudi Arabia has the potential to be part of that conflict or a coalition against Iran.
Just to wrap up this session, Professor Marandi, do you think that the Trump's presidency would put some sort of doubts within the resistance, or is it going to make even more unified, then making more powerful, because they need to make a decision against the United States? Because when we have 2 pictures from the Democratic Party and Republican Party, we know that at the end of the day, the policy is the same, but how does it feel within the resistance? How do they feel about the Trump's presidency?
You know, in the United States, and this, I'm sure you know this better than I, but there are a lot, from polls, the majority of Americans are against this genocide. So the majority of Americans are sane people. Um, Despite the fact that it's being censored, big tech is hiding, they're using algorithms to shield Americans from reality. Legacy media is telling the opposite from the truth often. But Americans are overwhelmingly against the genocide and very increasingly hostile towards the Israeli regime. But for whatever reason, many Americans who probably don't like the Democratic Party, but they feel that that's their only option, they've been in a tight spot when it comes to protesting and coming to the streets and being active against the genocide. Now that Trump has come to power, a lot of these people are going to have greater incentive to come to the streets. Just like we saw Black Lives Matter, we saw, we saw forces at play in the United States during the Trump reign that we haven't seen so much in the last 40 years. I think that these people are not going to let, I think that many, and I don't mean to be cynical, many are very sincere, many will use Gaza or whatever they can find as a tool against Trump because of their hatred for Trump. So Trump, I think, is going to face many challenges at home. And I think the economy is going to get worse. And Trump being Trump, regardless of the fact that the United States has destroyed its image and its credibility, and the West has across the world because of its policies, including Gaza. But I think Trump is worse than Biden or Harris in that regard, because he's disliked across the world. There's some places where he has popularity, but generally speaking, Trump is more divisive, and therefore U.S. soft power, which has already been diminished, will become increasingly diminished. And even in our country and in other countries, even though Gaza has destroyed the view of many young liberals or people who would traditionally be pro-Western, it has disillusioned them, that segment of society that has traditionally been Western-oriented. They see the West really for what it is now. But still, Trump coming to power unifies countries against the United States even more. So while, for example, in Iran, that segment of youth that believed the West was a force for good 2-3 years ago, they've seen the reality now. No one sees the West as good. But Trump coming to power makes the United States even more of a problem. So the United States, I think, under Trump, unites countries more, countries that are being antagonized by the United States. It's more difficult for the United States to divide them. And also, I think it brings countries across the world that are closer to one another and draws them, by and large, away from the United States. So I think he isolates the United States. He will even have problems with his so-called European allies or his proxies. So the resistance, in my opinion, the axis of resistance and the broader resistance is everyone. It's all those people demonstrating across the world,
BRICS.
Jews, BRICS, but also civil society, young Jews, Christians, Muslims, people from all walks of life in the United States, across Europe, who are protesting. They're the resistance. They are a part of this resistance against this Holocaust, against genocide, and they're playing their own heroic role. I think it strengthens the resistance. I think it strengthens BRICS. Again, going back to the partial rapprochement between India and China, I think that is a significant sign that India doesn't want BRICS to be weak, because they feel they need BRICS. And then Brazil, the president of Brazil was saying just a couple of days ago that he prefers Biden to Trump. So this is not going to go well for Trump, in my opinion, or for the regime in Washington. And so it strengthens this broader resistance, it strengthens the global majority, and most particularly, it strengthens, in my opinion, the axis of resistance. The axis of resistance, which is the hope for the defeat of ethno-supremacism and the prevention of the extermination of the Palestinian people in Gaza. That resistance will grow stronger, both within each part of this axis of resistance, but also as a unit. I think they will be strengthened.
Thank you so much, Professor Marandi, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
All right.